Welcome to Beyond Chronic Burnout, the show for neurodivergent, disabled, and professionals in high stress environments who are ready to break free from burnout, prioritize their well being, and find sustainable, supportive solutions to thrive in their personal and professional lives. Today, we're kicking off a very special 4 episode series on grief during the holidays. The first 3 episodes are dropping at once today, so you can binge them in order or jump to the conversation that resonates most with you. Tune in next Wednesday, December 11th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for a special episode where I will be sharing neurodivergent grief and burnout during the holidays. And we will share connection and community live in the YouTube premiere chat. So be sure to save this to your calendar and join me and our Unveiler community next Wednesday for this live conversation. The holidays can bring joy, but they can also amplify the pain of loss. Whether that's the loss of a loved one, a major life shift, or even the loss of your sense of self. And for us neurodivergent and disabled folks, the weight of grief can feel even heavier. In this first episode, I'm joined by Samantha Pickering, a life coach and grief educator who shares her deeply personal story of losing her son, Thomas, and how that loss shaped her life's mission. Samantha's work through her grief support boxes and grief movement classes helps people process grief in ways that honor their unique journeys. Get ready for a heartfelt conversation filled with insights, tools, and reminders that you are not alone. This conversation is truly touching and is inspiring as well as comforting. At least it was to me. Let's dive in.
Step out of the shadows, feel the power rise. Catch the spark inside you, let your spirit fly. Beyond the chronic burnout, Carol Jean's your guide. Find your steady rhythm, nice joy on the tide. Flourish forward, bright and bold. Leave the burnout far behind. In this journey, hearts unfold. Power's yours, seek and find.
I am so excited to have you here today, Samantha, because the second we met, I knew you were one of my people.
Thank you.
And just not just the beautiful things that you are doing in the world, but the glorious light that you are being.
Oh.
And I could not think of anyone else. My good friend Kate is also part of this series. And when I was thinking about, well, what do I want to do for the month of December? I thought, I know this is going to seem counterintuitive, but I want to talk about grief. Because over the years, within our autistic community, this conversation comes up so often here at the holidays.
Yeah.
Because whether it's new grief, whether it's grief that you've had in your life for a while, there is something about the holiday season that really amplifies grief in a lot of ways. And it's also, I have found the opportunity where when it does come up, it gives us a new point of reflection on what am I seeing or feeling or discovering now about my experience of grief that maybe I hadn't, during the summer or in the spring, but during this, it's brought new things to light. Yeah. What would you say about sort of the grief and the holidays and that sort of kicking off that conversation, Samantha?
Grief and the holidays is huge. I mean, grief and the seasons in itself is its own different topic where you're talking about the nuances of grief as each season comes around. But we have just started with Halloween, Guy Fawkes in the UK, we've got Remembrance Sunday and Veterans Day and all those kind of big times of remembrance of those that we love and lost. before we even start into the family gatherings that are the Christmas, the Thanksgiving, New Year. It is a huge, huge time for people that are struggling with grief, and equally for those that are neurospicy, because the rules just seem, the TV and everything says we do it this way. The reality of the intricacies of our family and our connections is this way. And how do we combine all of that in a time period when we are naturally going into a period where we need more rest than ever before? It's getting darker, our bodies are trying to slow down. We need to winter well if we're going to be able to have the energy to manage spring and summer and everything that comes next. But in the midst of that, we've got all these family griefs and journeys to try to comprehend. It's not easy, not impossible, not easy, and every year brings a new nuance to it, as you said.
It really does. And I love your approach of looking at seasons. I mean, to me, that just makes a lot of sense. You know, I mean, I think that's one of the things that the modern world and technology and things have like removed
Yes.
from our natural rhythms, our natural cycles. And as you were talking about, you know, the changing of light, you know, for those of us who are also affected by seasonal affect, you know, those types of things we don't even think about. How does that play into my emotions, my season of feeling and
How does
process?
it how does it fall into the amount of energy we have to process anything if our body is already depleted and ready to rest? We don't have the extra spoons to be able to socialize in the way that we could do back in summer. Um, Sometimes we don't even have the extra energy to get up out of bed and do things. And on top of that, we may have the extra burden, the extra weight of grief as well to carry. And it's just letting people understand that you're not losing it just because you're struggling at this time of year. This is actually normal, natural. Technology, lights, everything else, I've shifted us away from it, but we can't change the fact that somehow deep down in us there is still this need to winter well.
I love that phrase, winter well. Sam, how do you define grief? How do you explain grief to someone?
The grief that I tend to work with most is from the loss of a child or the loss of a close connection. Grief in itself can come in many forms, and it's the definition has got quite broad now. So grief is where you believe your life is going in one direction, everything is forward thinking, this is your future, and then some big change happens. That could be a divorce, that could be a change of job, it could be loss of income. There is still a grief. There is still that this is what I was doing and everything is changing. The depth of the grief that I particularly focus in is around bereavement, and in particular, I say the loss of a child, which is a subject that people just don't want to talk about. They know it happens. They'd like to avoid the reality that it happens. And when something like this does happen, people don't know what to say, don't know what to do, want to help, but are petrified of saying the wrong thing, or don't know how to manage their emotions around the grief, let alone being able to start to comprehend what the grieving parents are going through.
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, everything that you just said. that it's so that's just so accurate. So accurate. Oh my gosh. Yes.
I have to kind of explain that grief does cover so many things. I mean, loss of a pet is still a grief, is still a huge connection for a lot of people. Loss of a friend can be, in some family situations, closer than a family member that's died. I do not want to belittle other forms of grief that are out there because they really, truly do hurt. But I am here for that more taboo subject that people just don't talk about, which is the loss of a child. But we need to understand about grief. What I don't want is a parent like myself suddenly attending a grief group and assuming that they're just turning up to hear about people that have lost other close connections, and finding out they've actually got the wrong group because it wasn't specific enough, because the term grief has now got very broad.
Yeah. Growing up, one of my classmates, we were in preschool, and they were neighbors and we carpooled together. And his older brother died suddenly. And his mom, Nikki McDonald, became, as I grew up and even in my adulthood, became a tremendous mentor to me, because very similar to your journey, Samantha, she took the passing of Christopher and turned it into, because there wasn't anything, back in the late 70s, there really wasn't, like we talk about, this is a taboo topic. There weren't support groups, really. There weren't people openly talking. I mean, no one knows what to say in this to be supportive, or they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And it was through her and knowing and learning just by being, connected and friends with Nikki, that when I was late identified as autistic and, right as I was turning 40, there's this part of the processing phase and late identification that is an identity crisis. And there is a grieving period for who you knew yourself to be.
Yeah.
And this place of, now I'm not who I thought I was. And there's this loss of that. And there grief in that way as well. And
Very
that's
much
sort of the grief work that I do in this. But Samantha, I would love for you and invite you to just share so that people know a little bit more about you as the person, because you are a wonderful expert in this area, right? And I think that's one of the things I think when we talk about like tech and stuff, I'm like, no, y'all, we got to have like the real conversation. I mean, we can talk about the research, the studies, we're people.
Yeah.
Samantha, what brought you to this work? How has grief and burnout shown up for you?
How has it shown up for me? If we go back to 2021, so we've gone through COVID, we're dealing with COVID-3 lockdown. At that point, I'm a mum of 6 children. I have been phenomenally blessed. But my 6 children had a rather large age range between them. My youngest was 18 months. My second youngest was only 3. Then my son was 15. Then I have a daughter who is 17, one who was 19, and one who was 20. So a very large age range. We'd gone through first lockdowns, 18th birthdays and first lockdowns. That was interesting. So you imagine a lockdown with teenagers and babies all in one house. It's a good cooking pot. And I forgot.
We'd have a lot of dance parties at my house.
Yes, we had a lot of very interesting times. I'd also had to have some big surgeries around that time as well. So I'd been disabled anyway, but I was extra disabled by everything that had gone on. And my mental health was not in the greatest of places at the time. And then on the 4th of March 2021, I went down to wake my son for online schooling. It was the last day before he could return to school because he was due to start doing his GCSE exams. And he was dead. He just was not alive anymore. And there was no warning. He had been our fine, fit, healthy 15-year-old son, the lad that was doing online classes with a flak jacket on with all his books stuffed in it, doing his PE classes while everybody else just sat down and did whatever they wanted. He was into everything. And then he was gone. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But in the same instant, I still had to be a mum for 5 children. One who lived away and the rest that were still all in my house. So that primeval scream that I wanted to do, part of my neurospicy brain kicked in and go, you can't do this. You're a mum. You must put on the mum role. And that having to find a way to be able to grieve and parent and work out who the hell I was now was just been the most excruciating, most barbaric journey I can ever imagine anybody having to go on. The pit that I went into, I honestly didn't think I would ever be able to come back out of. And there were numerous times when I pulled the slight tendrils of strength that I'd managed to find to try to reach my hand out of this pit to ask for help, only to find that the support services in my area were not set up for my specific loss situation. I was wrong postcode, I was wrong form of death for my son, wrong
How is
age
that
for the
even
family.
possible? How does someone say that?
Unfortunately, a lot of grief support is run by organisations that are charities in the UK, and those charities have to have very fixed guidelines of what they can and can't support. If he died of cancer, then there'll be access to the hospice side of things, but they were very busy. During COVID lockdown, the support service for people that had died of a sudden death was closed because too many people had died suddenly through this worldwide pandemic. They just couldn't keep the services running. If my son had been a baby in arms, I would have been able to access the support there because of his age. But he was 15. He was a fit, healthy 15-year-old. It shouldn't have happened, but it still did, because a brain aneurysm, when it goes like that. For him, it was thankfully as peaceful as it could be. And I have to remain forever grateful for that, because I know too many people lose too many people that they love in horrendous ways. But I have to say, as a mum, to find your child in that state and still have other children that are alive that you've got to care for, knowing what it's like to walk in on that situation is its own journey, its own trauma to work with. And I had to find a way to work with these issues so that they didn't destroy me, and so I could continue to parent and in time do something that was going to be a legacy to my son, create something that would help fill the gap and help other people that would fall into the cracks that unfortunately we did with my loss. So
when you were in this place, I know it's so hard, and it's not something that the majority of us recognize in the moment. It is that is a rare unicorn individual that recognizes grief and burnout.
yeah. I knew I was struggling beforehand, so I knew that some of the thought patterns that were coming up, I had to check whether they were really from the grief or whether it was something else going on, and had to work out at one point, because I splintered into so many different pieces that didn't connect anymore. And unbeknown to me, or beknown to me but not fully understood from me, I am neurospicy. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, so I'm very hypermobile. There's a strong link with Ehlers-Danlos and ADHD, and I'd always had issues with dyslexia through school, but some of the things had not been picked up because I was articulate, because I tried 110% in everything I was doing. And yes, so what? Sam couldn't spell and write properly, but she could do everything else that she was asked to do, and she did it with passion and all that drive to succeed. But then the as my world came crashing down, I realized how many of these fake boundaries I'd put up and fake defenses I'd put up just to hide what was truly going on for me, and just to try to cope in the world as I thought I had to cope. It sounds very strange to be saying this now, but in some respects, I'm actually grateful for my grief, because it's shown me so much more about myself, bits that I'd forgotten, bits that are part of me from when I was younger that I needed to get back in touch with. I needed to be able to understand again. But because of the defenses I'd built around it, and because of those defenses that I'd put that were actually leading me to burnout, because they've all come crumbling down, the new me I'm rebuilding, and I'm not going to say to anybody I am a perfect reconstructed human being at all. I am definitely one of those very cracked, beautiful Japanese vases, you know, the golden threads that hold you together.
Kitsuguni or kitsune.
That's it. And I'm not even complete with that, but I'm pretty all right with the progress so far. But I don't want to lie to people. I don't want to say, I've got this all sorted. I know how to do all of this, because the reality is I know my journey through this. I know in that woodland of darkest grief where you can't work out where to turn next, I can stand next to somebody and go, it's all right. Let's catch our breath in this moment, look around us and work out which is going to be the right direction for each individual, because we are all so different and brought into a grief journey in a different way and with a different level of past life events that have added to who we are. And it's that ability to see who the person is, I think, that really needs to be at the key for any support.
Oh my goodness, I couldn't agree with you more. And thank you so much for being open and sharing your journey with us in this conversation today, Samantha, because it's not easy to tell, it's not easy to live, it's certainly, not easy to hear, but I think it's conversation that we need to have more of, that we are not having enough of, because no one on this planet escapes this life without experiencing or being touched by grief in some way.
Oh, very much so. And the only reason I can talk this way is because I've had to learn to be able to talk about my grief. I've had to be able to talk about my son without bursting into tears, because I got so sick and fed up of walking into rooms where everybody knew I'd lost my son, but nobody dared mention him. It was like he was sat there as an elephant in the room, and we all know how awful that elephant in the room situation is, when you know there's something about you that other people want to say, but they don't know what to say and you don't know what to say. So I've had to find my words and find ways of, instead of being blocked by my grief, being able to walk into a room and go, this is me and this is my grief. It's the side of me, and it's a package deal, and it doesn't worry me and I don't worry it, and we've kind of found our level ground in life. In the bad days, it's like my grief's tapping me on my head. I feel like my son's there going, Mum, you've done too much. You're pushing your boundaries. When grief gets hard, going back to the basics of who I am is important. And it just, for me, it feels like my son helps me out with that in a bit, rather than it being something that's scary.
Oh, absolutely. So I want to tap into your zone of genius and your experience. What saps our energy in grief? Because there's this dual existence that can happen. It's, I was totally fine, and then grief shows up, and now burnout is showing up. And then there's this other part where I was already in some degree of spicy burnout, and then grief showed up, and then it all just got worse. So just in a general sense, even, What saps our energy most in grief?
What saps our energy most in grief is not understanding how much our brain is desperately trying to work to comprehend what's happened, and how much our brain is prepared to jump to stories of, if only I did this, or I should have done that, rather than face the reality of the fact that this loss has happened, and that even if we'd said something different, done something different, most cases, nothing could have changed. This loss was still happening. And it takes so much energy having this narrative running away in our brain, trying to comprehend what's going on. In life, we almost have a filing cabinet in our brain for deaths that we expect to come in a set chronological order. We're taught from a young age, the oldest will die first. So we expect our grandparents to die, then our parents, partners, friends, siblings, eventually, once we're dead and gone, our children. So chronological deaths, deaths in an order that we've expected, or natural order deaths, we at least have some level filing cabinet in our brain to go, oh, I hate this. This feels really wrong. This isn't right. But yes, I can still kind of put it in that drawer in my brain, and it sits a little bit more comfortably. With the death of a child, it's outside of the natural order of everything we're ever taught. It shouldn't happen with modern technology, the way it is with advances in medical care, advances in our own personal health. It shouldn't happen, or at least that's what we're led to believe. So when a death of a child does occur, it hasn't got that place in the filing cabinet to sit. And so it takes even longer for our brain to find anything to slightly connect it, to process it, and begin to work through it. And until any grief, any loss has those places in our brain to connect to, we are facing flashbacks, we're facing overwhelm from all the sights, sounds, smells, or whatever we witnessed at the time. We're facing all the, if only I'd done this, I should have done that. Why didn't I do this? And the last time I talked to them, how didn't I know this was the last time? It takes so much brain capacity. But we live in a world that goes, you do this, you do the paperwork, you do the funeral, then you're fine and back on with life because we're busy, busy, busy. Has that been your experience with grief? Have you completed your grief journey just because the funeral is over? No. Very few people have. The
I
grief
don't even
journey
know that the
starts.
grief even begins
It doesn't.
until after all of
After.
that, because it's almost like you just go into this autopilot of checking the boxes
Yeah. You have that
until
little
it gets
system in your
quiet.
brain. Yeah, exactly. You have that little system in your brain that goes, I must contact the undertaker, I must get the death certificate, I must do this, I must do that. Or at least you have an idea of some people that you could talk to that would give you some of these pinpoints. And then the funeral happens, and then you're left with the time that nobody ever talks about, the time after the funeral, the time when grief begins,
Oh my
and
goodness,
when
yes.
most people leave you because they assume the funeral's done, the wake is done, that's it, you're all right.
Samantha, one of the things in this segment of what saps our energy and grief that comes up for me that I think, and I just want to hear your take on this because I love the way that you speak and think and process information from this lens, and that is the thoughts are huge. They are massive consumers of energy. We consume more thought energy than we do of other than digestion throughout our
Yeah.
day as humans. But there's this place that comes to me in when I'm thinking about my own grief journeys, and that is when you were talking about the linear experience, sort of the checklist of this is how we process grief. This is what it is. This is what you're supposed to be doing, quote unquote, during this process. But there is this place of control and feeling a loss of control and safety and feeling very unsafe.
Yeah. It's when you find that you're not following any set checklist of grief and you're not doing a set 5 ways and magically out of grief, it is petrifying. And then you have people telling you you're grieving in the wrong way, or are you still grieving? Well, it's already been a year. Aren't you over it yet? Or it was
Oh,
only
I'm sorry.
your.
My Victorian black dress that I've strapped on for the last year, I can finally take it off and somehow I'm okay.
But we don't even have that, do we? We
We
don't
don't
have
even have
any
that
physical
anymore.
sign that says to the rest of the world, look, please be gentle with me. Do not bombard me with all your rubbish as to what's gone on in the soap opera, what's gone on with whether you got this takeaway cup or that or the minutiae of life that is important at other times, but when you are so overwhelmed with trying to process grief, you haven't got that in you, the capacity to listen to other people and to receive all of their issues and all their expectations of how you should be grieving and what you should be doing at this stage.
I'm curious as well because, I believe there's this element of control because when you lose someone, especially sudden or unexpectedly, it doesn't even matter. It can be a thousand different ways, but there is this sense of this loss of control and this shift in safety. But what I noticed for myself
Mm.
and for those who I love dearly who have experienced grief in all dimensions is this isolation that happens
Yeah.
and how energy draining both sides of that is. Socializing and connecting feel draining. Being alone is draining. What are your thoughts or experience or insights around that isolation and socialization element of grief and energy?
So you have a lot of adrenaline running when you're in grief. And I mean, some people get to an absolute freeze state where they can't do anything because everything feels too unsafe to go out. Nothing, they don't know anything about themselves, what's right, what's safe in the world, or anything. And you can be isolated in that freeze state. You can also find yourself, if you've tried to go out and talk to people and be with people, and then being confronted by their overwhelming energy of asking or saying things that seem to not get where you are at that point in time, or whether they expect you to be over it, or whether they might say a passing comment that they don't realize how painful that is for you to hear, just because you're walking around with an open wound that they can't see. And you get to a point where I know from my own experience, I would walk down the street with my little children and I'd have neighbours come out and talk to me, and they'd want to know on Mother's Day when my son's funeral was going to be. And I was just desperately trying to hold myself together to do Mother's Day as a broken mother, but I'd pulled myself enough to take my little children out and try to give them a normal, oh, we're being really nice, we're looking after mum, we're doing something special for her. And then being confronted by people wanting to know the reality of when my son's funeral was. They didn't realize, they didn't think, actually, we could ask her another time, or can see she's just having a moment with the little ones. Let's just let them enjoy that moment and we'll check in another time. Or people would start telling you their grief stories, and it's everybody needs to be heard in their grief at the moment they've lost somebody. You don't need in that moment somebody coming and telling you about an auntie that they've lost 10 years ago. It's not that you're not feeling compassionate. It's just when you start going, oh yes, yes, that's going to be very painful for you, and yes, I can hear that you struggled with that. You're stretching your final bits of energy out to them, and also feeling your loss and the state you're in this particular moment is the newest loss is not being seen and witnessed properly. And then that leaves you feeling as if people are drawing more energy from you that you just barely brought together to get out and do something, and that can force you to hide back inside. And
yes. When you feel like people are clawing at you and pulling away from you.
And people do want to know how somebody has died. There is a natural human instinct. It's a survival instinct. In that when somebody's died, everybody around them wants to know what's happened, how's it happened. What they're not saying is, will it affect me? Will it affect me and my own? Am I going to be safe? Once they've checked in with you to know what's happened, they've checked in that they're safe, they're okay to go off in their journey. Their safety issue is dealt with, but yours isn't. You've been drained even further. And it is a human instinct. I don't think we're ever going to be able to change that human instinct. But we need to be aware of, for the receiving end of the person who's lost somebody, how that can be very depleting at that point. And by all means, check in and want to find out what happened, but what support are you giving with that energy that they're giving back to you? The energy needs to be a two-way transaction, two-way agreement. Transaction was the word I was looking for then.
I always talk about the reciprocity of things because, and I think when we're talking about grief, there is that place that I don't think is as harmonious as it could be when we are people who love and are there to try and support others. I think the heart to be in reciprocity might be there, but the delivery may be falling short.
Yeah.
When we talk about, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll leave that one for later. That's okay.
I love, you've got so many good nuggets, and I don't want to miss any of these. So I want to make sure we get them all here, as many as we can. We may just have to do this again. But Samantha, I mean, as we're talking about the things that drain our energy and grief, whether you were or recognize or were aware that you may have been in burnout prior to grief or not, grief and burnout are very similar in how they impact our physiology, our overall well-being. What are some of those similar places that stand out for you?
The crushing weight of both, of the crushing weight of grief, the crushing weight of burnout, the sheer energy sapping of both, where you just don't, there is nothing left in you to give anymore. And I think all of us in our own way give out a little bit of light by just what we do and how we show up in the world. And when you get to a point where you are so done with the burnout or with the grief that that light no longer shines, that's an incredibly difficult place to be. And it's very hard to begin to extinguish. Well, you feel as if that light's been extinguished. It's trying to relight that light and find a way to build yourself back again. So I think that's been my big experience with grief and burnout. It's just so difficult facing either. And if the two come at once, it's really not the nicest recipe to be living with.
No, it doesn't. And one seems to fuel the other in so
Yes.
many ways. It's like this fire that just keeps consuming and consuming. You know, the grief
It
is
makes
this
it harder.
crushing weight.
It makes it hard to find a way back out of it as well, because for every step you try to take forward, there's a motion backwards as well, and you seesaw a lot and trying to work out, is this my grief that I'm dealing with, or is this the burnout, and how can I marry the two to make them work and support each other rather than be something that is constantly fighting against each other.
Oh my goodness, yes. I I don't even know that in my own experience that I could separate or that I did separate the two. It was just like they were just rolled in this ball together to navigate. And it wasn't like I was able to go, okay, this one, I'm going to handle this one this way, and I'm going to handle this one this way. It was just this compounding weight of both that was, it felt inescapable. And it was just like this oppressive, all consumingness, I get, for lack of another word. But you have some really extraordinary and very impactful ways of moving into from that place of grief and burnout and in that overwhelming exhaustion, how we begin to stabilize ourselves again. And this, I know this, we want it to be this grand, one big sweeping thing. It's like, okay, I'm going to
I
open
wish.
my eyes in the morning. I know, right? And I'm going to be back to myself, right? I'm going to feel normal. And there's, to me, in the process of things, especially, you know, burnout itself, it's this ebb and flow. I might be fine for a couple of days. I might be fine for a couple of weeks or months. And then all of a sudden I'm not okay. And
And yeah,
that expectation can be really hard when we think it's this linear path and we want it to be comfortable, because the nonlinear path is not comfortable. It's not predictable. I don't feel safe in that. So how do we begin from that place of like, this is everything, this is the worst of it all? What's the first thing when we don't feel like we have energy or bandwidth for anything? Where do we start, Samantha?
I think particularly with the combination of burnout and grief, burnout, at least you had an idea of who you were or who you are. With grief, that kind of vanished, that kind of absolutely splintered so that you don't know anything. I mean, I know in myself, I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wore, what I ate, if I even wanted to eat again. I mean, my child was dead. Should I really be still living? Um, I knew nothing about myself at all. And then on top of that, I had this weight of burnout that I just didn't think I ever wanted to find out anything about myself ever again. And it had I had to learn to take each moment in that moment. So instead of that question so many people ask us, how are you? I had no answer for that question because I didn't know how I was. I didn't even know who I was, let alone how I was. But I could have told you that in that precise moment, I was alive and breathing, and some days that was good enough. Other days I could have told you, actually, I've got out of bed and I've done something today, and I'm proud of that. But equally, 10 minutes beforehand, I may have been thinking I couldn't get out of bed at all. I needed people to ask me, how was I in that moment? Not needing to know everything that I was fighting through, not asking me the scale of what was going on around me. I just needed to be able to cling on to that singular moment. We have senses in our body. We know that we've got sight, sound, touch, smell. When we are in a fight, flight, freeze situation, so when our adrenaline is running, we don't connect. When we're feeling unsafe, we don't connect to our senses. We're just on that survival mode. When the adrenaline begins to fade away and the deeper parts of grief hit, that's the time that we then need to start looking at the tiniest connections to ourselves. And by connecting to ourselves, connecting to our senses, we just give some pillars to be able to create and re-knit ourselves again. So for me, it was finding a fragrance that I liked. And actually, before I start podcasts, I often spray a fragrance, and it just, okay, I've got myself in this moment. This is something I like. This is something I like the smell of. It just brings me back to myself. But I had to go through a lot of different sense of smell to work out what that was. I had to taste lots of different foods, things that I liked before, things that I didn't like before. And my tastes have actually changed in grief. I didn't expect that to have happened, but they have. And things that I liked when I was young that I suddenly stopped liking, some of those have come back. But I needed to create little tiny manageable steps. So for the days that I didn't want to get out of bed, that I didn't feel I could do anything, I still would touch, say, a crystal or even a stone, just something, so that my sense of touch was brought into this moment. And being aware of the moment that we're in right now helps calm the rest of the thought patterns that are going on in our brain, and just gives us a little bit of breathing space in our grief and in our burnout to allow us to go, oh, actually, I did cope with that moment. And that tool is helping me. And maybe if I find another one, I can gradually build up more. When I could, I also took my children out for regular walks outside, because children need to be outside. It was the last thing I wanted to do. I didn't want to see people. I couldn't cope with the energy exchange from people after the initial overwhelm of everybody wanting their piece of what's going on. I needed some time to just rest myself. But by connecting to nature and seeing the very tiny changes in the environment around me, I was able to go, oh, the world's still moving, but the world that I want to connect to is this world of nature around me that goes slowly. It goes at a safe speed that I can cope with, because I didn't care what was going on the internet. I didn't care what was going on TV. I didn't care what went on at work or anything else. I didn't have the bandwidth. I was in survival mode. I had my children to get through this. I couldn't find any extra bandwidth to care about anything else. But by connecting to nature and seeing slow, gradual changes as the year progressed, gave me an ability to keep doing the next step and the next step. And there were times when, even doing that, it was too much, and I found myself slipping back, or just having periods where I just couldn't do anything. And at that point, I did have to go to the doctors and say, look, I'm really struggling now. I need something just to rest my brain for a little bit. But then I also said to the doctor, and the minute I feel that I'm okay to cope, I will be coming off it, because I do not want to be on that. And I just gave myself incremental stops to shut some of the chatter in my brain. And then that pause allowed me to find more of my senses again, and to build back that framework of me. And I had to have that combination, but I knew instinctively that I couldn't just numb it all with medication. I didn't want to go down the route of drinking constantly. I have drunk. I will not say I haven't. There are times when I've definitely needed a drink. But then equally, if I've said I've needed a drink, I've been super cautious, because I think if my body is telling me I need something, I actually need the reverse of it. I need to rest, or I need to do something else. I may have that drink another time, but not in the need moment. What I need to do in the need moment is work out, what did I really need? Did I need somebody to help me at that point? Was I crying out for extra support that I wasn't getting elsewhere? And that usually untangled it enough. But it has taken awareness. It's taken awareness of how I'm responding to my children and how I want to respond to my children. And I've wanted to be able to find ways to grieve and live. And having a young child that was only 18 months, she didn't know a great deal about her brother. So for her, I had to have stories about him. And by being able to tell stories and openly discuss my son, that helped. My 3-year-old was going to the park and going, "My brother's died, you know," to any strangers she saw. And that was so shocking for people. But I was having to back her up and go, "She's telling you the truth. This is what she needs to do in the moment. Please just listen to her." That beautiful innocence of children that are in the moment with their emotions, and they show you some of the things you need to do. But one of my older teenagers couldn't stand my son's name being mentioned and was suicidal at any discussion of him. So it knitting all of those experiences into my own grief journey has given me, I suppose, a slightly broader view than some other situations may have brought. I wouldn't
Goodness,
recommend it on
yes.
anyone.
No.
I mean, it's brutal. It really is. But it's not something that will destroy me, because my son wouldn't have wanted to destroy me. And I want the world to know about him.
And I know that all of the work that you do now, you say, is dedicated into honoring this journey and experience that you've had, and Thomas himself. Finding those places of stabilization through our sensory system is huge. It is so huge, and it is in burnout as well. I know that two of the many resources that you have to sort of begin stabilizing ourselves. Two of the ones I would love for you just to touch on briefly and just give everybody a little insight, because this might be something someone goes, "Oh, I haven't thought that." And those two things are grief movement and sound healing.
Yeah. So grief movement was something, when I realized that I didn't want to stay medicated, that I realized I needed to work with my grief. I needed to stop running away from it. I learned from the amazing David Kessler about becoming a grief educator, and I am so phenomenally amazed with that man and how he speaks to people about grief. And he just got me. He spoke to my heart. He spoke to the wounds that were there and let me see that I could keep going. And through learning about his work, I also learned about Paul Dennison, who does grief movement, which is using movement, breath, and sound. And for those moments where you do not have the words to express your grief, but know it's a simmering pot inside of you that has to be released and isn't just something that is in your head. You can feel the exhaustion in your body. You can feel the physical pain in your body. You just need a way to express that. And that's what grief movement is all about. The first stages are about grounding yourself, so about connecting to your body in this moment where it's at. You are deepening your breath, you are connecting your feet to the ground, you are using sounds like the sound VOO, but it's a prolonged sound, so you go VOO. And I know you won't hear the rest of that, so I'll stop at that point. But that sound in itself vibrates and regulates the nervous system. And using connections of breath, and there are lots of different breathing techniques that can be used, and sometimes it's finding the ones that work for you. But if you're in a point where you do not have the energy to search and try different things and read up about this form and read up about that form, for me, finding a class where somebody had already walked the steps ahead of me and gone through a grief and had learnt these movements and was showing me, and then I found I was actually having a release of just some of that pressure and releasing some of the tears and some of the anger and reconnecting, creating a space within myself that had been so overwhelmed by the emotions, but now had space to allow the beautiful memories to start coming back, was so important. Sorry, my daughter's just crept in. Hello, go on, that way. So that grief movement has just been for those times when you don't have the words to talk to a counsellor or friends. Sorry. Anastasia, out. Out. Right.
Hey, it's part of life. And on this show, we just show up as life occurs. And that's just how it is. We have
I'm
to
a mum with
and
multiple children. Life
exactly.
happens.
So why would we make that or gloss over that in any way? Because I think that's one of the important parts. But grief movement, I know, has just been such a big part, and it's what you also teach as well. And it's such a beautiful place because really it does help to stabilize our emotions, our nervous system, the grounding sometimes to ourselves for the first time in a long time if we've disconnected. And I think that's such a beautiful gift to be able to share because I don't think everybody is aware of the impact that sound and movement and our sensory system plays and how we begin to find this new place within ourselves as we are in the journey of grief and experiencing
emotions, grief. Especially big emotions that we find in grief. Emotions need motion. Emotions aren't something just to sit in our head and fill our head. We don't have to hold back anger just because we're told to be good girls and not be angry. We're allowed to be angry. We're allowed to be sad. We're allowed to be frustrated. We're allowed to be resentful. We're allowed all of our emotions. They are a huge part of us. And that failure to connect to our emotions, that attempt to squash them into a jar and bottle them up, is where the burnout and the grief really struggle, because emotions are not meant to be managed that way. Emotions are our natural way of checking how safe we are in the world and going, that bit's not quite right for me. Oh, that bit is. Oh, yeah. But we've forgotten to do that.
Yeah. Samantha, as we're wrapping up, what is the one thing today, if somebody is joining us and they are saying, I am experiencing grief right now, what do they need to know today, right now, in this moment?
Grief isn't something to run away from. It's not something to be afraid of. It will not destroy you. But you do need to work and learn to listen to what it's trying to tell you, to work with the emotions that it's bringing up with you, to work with those uncomfortable situations and those uncomfortable stories that are being created in your mind, and learn to understand what's being processed in your mind, what's being processed in your body, and what the reality is around you as well. And grief is a huge time of change and transformation. And I'm not about to say grief is something that miraculously teaches you a lesson. But grief isn't an enemy to run away from. The minute you try to bottle it and squash those emotions and run away from them is where you're asking for a bigger situation to occur and think for you to become potentially very, very ill from it. And grief builds on grief. What you sometimes find when you're facing a loss is that because you didn't understand how to connect your mind and your body and work with the emotions, you can find that a grief that you thought you'd dealt with by just squashing it and storing it away in a box suddenly comes back after another grief that you've suffered. And at that point, it really is telling you that I need to find a new way to begin to process all of this. And it's about taking your grief from being a blockage in front of you and shifting it to become something that walks alongside with you. We will face grief in life. The important thing about the person that we are missing is not that they died, but that is very front and center in our lives. It's not even that they were born, it's their lifetime, that stage in between. And by moving our grief to our side, we learn to understand and connect back to who they were in their lifetime. What were the important things about them? What did they teach us in return? But while we're still trying to process the death, that all the emotions around the loss, we can't begin to tap into any of those lifetime connections. And for me, I mean, if you'd asked me about my son, I can remember a counsellor asking me about my son in the early weeks after I'd lost him. What was my son like? And I couldn't tell you anything. I couldn't tell her anything about what he was like at that stage, because all my brain could process was the overwhelming images and thoughts that he was gone, because that's where my brain was at. I hadn't learned to take what was in my brain and in my body and move them.
When you've put something together, we started this conversation talking about how our grief and how we process and how we live as humans comes in seasons. And you have something that I think is just truly, truly beautiful. And you have something called a grief box. Share with us what the grief box is and, how we can get this, if it's just for people in the UK, and who it's for.
At the moment, the grief support box is just in the UK, but I'm hoping in time to roll it out to other countries. What I'd like to do in the long term is have it so that the things actually came from the country of origin rather than be sent all over the place, because I just think each country, each culture has their own unique ways of connecting to grief. And I want to honour and respect that as well within these boxes, not just put my UK understanding of grief into each box. They are designed for people that have lost parents, grandparents, siblings, even friends, pets, and other connections. The grief box is a one-off box that has 5 items to connect the person to their senses. It has a card that explains about that specific loss. So the loss of a father is very different to the loss of a brother, or the loss of a friend. There are nuances in each loss. very different again to the loss of your partner or spouse. So there's a card that explains about some of the things that people face within that specific loss, and a basic grief first aid list, so that when you are in having a day where you are really struggling with your grief, it's just a checklist of things to look at. And have I done these things? Could I try doing some of these things? Will they just give me a bit of breathing space in that moment in time? There is also inside the boxes.
Now, Samantha, these come based on each season, which I loved, right? So if you're in the fall or the winter, right?
This is where, so there's two types. There is a grief support box, which is for any loss, and then the bereaved parents box covers the 4 seasons. The reason for that is, and within the natural order, loss is hard, but a loss that is outside of the natural order, so what I call veloma, it's a Sanskrit word which means against the natural order, and it's a name that a lot of bereaved parents are calling themselves now, so veloma. That loss is so outside the realms of what we know and understand that if you try to tell everybody in one go that come summer you're going to be seeing all happy families on the beach, and you're just not going to be able to cope with that, especially when the radio and TV start telling you how awful it is to have your child off school or not away at a camp and having to care for them yourself when you've just buried your child.
Yeah.
You can't face that information if your child's just died in December and you're trying to face their first Christmas without them. So the boxes that are designed for parents that have lost children are 4 separate boxes sent out once every 3 months. So as the seasons change, they'll cover the seasonal issues that arise at that time. Each new box has different things, different senses to connect to, because our loss and our grief does change. There's information in there how to connect back to me for more support, a checkup on how they're doing in their journey as well, and access to the grief movement class, which is also included in the singular boxes. But I wanted to let people understand that there is such a difference. It's not saying other losses aren't horrendous. I mean, I've lost my own father. My husband's lost both of his parents. We've known a lot of losses within our family. But the loss of a child is just so out of the natural order that I wanted something that just helps bring that into the conversation even more.
Yeah. What I love about what you've done, though, is that through your own experience, through your own loss and not being able to find the resources right there, that this grief support box is accessible no matter where you're living. You can receive support of some sort. And Samantha, I'd love to ask, how do you get these? Who can get these? How do, is this like, oh, can I get this for my sister? Can I get this for a coworker?
They're designed to be bought by anybody who wants to support a friend, a family member, a work colleague, and just desperately wants to help but doesn't know what to say. And instead of having to find the words themselves, the words are in the box. The box says who has sent this gift to them. It lets the person know that that person doesn't know what to say but wants to help, wants to be able to talk openly about the person that you've lost, and would like to know from you how best they can work together with that. With each box that's sent out, the person who sends the box gets information as to what items are in the box, and they get ideas of how to talk to a person, how to open up a conversation around grief, one that isn't threatening to the person who's receiving those questions. So instead of that "how are you today" question, it's a more open conversation of, say, what did you think of this item that was in the box? How did it connect to your grief? Did you find it useful? Didn't you? To broaden up the conversation. And the idea is that the box is sent as a physical gift, with the emotional support around it. I'm one person. There's only so many people I can directly support one-to-one. What I want to create is a situation where each person that's grieving actually feels that they're receiving something and they've got that bigger connection for the people around them, rather than the people around them wanting to help, not knowing what to do and backing off because they just don't want to make a situation worse. They don't want to make somebody cry just by mentioning the person that's lost. When actually, most of the time, when you say the name of somebody that's died to the person who's lost them, they are so grateful to hear that name again, because you just don't hear it after a certain amount of time. And to not hear your partners, your husbands, your grandparents, your parents' name being spoken openly, and your child's name being spoken openly, is hard.
It is. And I love so much the heart and the thoughtful consideration and all the different elements that you've put into creating the grief support box. And we will have all the links down in the show notes if you live in the UK and would like to look at sharing and sending a grief support box to someone in your life. Samantha, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your heart, your mission, your passion, and your purpose with all of us.
Thank you. If people are outside of the UK and want to order it to be delivered to the UK, that I can arrange. But at the moment, I haven't got the network to send it out of the UK.
Well, maybe right now we just have a little call. If you're in another country and this speaks to your heart, maybe reach out to Samantha, and we'll have a link down in the show notes. And maybe you guys coordinate and collaborate on how to grow this. Thank you so much for being here. Absolutely. You know, my passion is to connect folks. And if we can do that right now, absolutely. Thanks so much for being here today. And if you're experiencing grief in this season, we see you, we hear you, we are here with you and for you. And if you are feeling alone, know that you can reach out in any way that you need to. Even just an emoji works. We're here if you're ready. Thank you so much for joining us today on Beyond Chronic Burnout. I hope you feel energized and ready to take on the challenges ahead. Remember, you are not alone in this journey. Let's stay connected. Go follow me over on Instagram at Carol Jean Whittington, where you can join our Beyond Chronic Burnout channel for personal messages from me each week, and subscribe to the podcast for more conversations and burnout insights. Together, we'll continue to break out of burnout and unlock our authentic selves. Until next time, this is Carol Jean Whittington signing off. Stay compassionately curious, my friends.
Thanks for being here. It's been quite a ride. Energy mastery, let's turn the tide. Top shelf guests, dropping wisdom bombs. Join us next week, where the energy's strong. Beyond chronic.